Welcome to the Great Traits Project podcast. We investigate the character traits that drive great achievements and reveal the mindset behind success. Throughout these podcasts, we introduce you to remarkable individuals from the world of sport, business, the military, the arts, science, technology, groundbreaking explorers, and many more. We shed light on how they behave and what they believe, and we discuss their attitude to life. In November 2016, we released our first book, which is called Great Traits. The book reveals the 5 character traits that make successful people tick, and it can be found on Amazon by searching for Great Traits, or search for the author's name, Tobias Harwood, which is spelled Tobias, and then Harwood, Harwood. All the author's proceeds from the sale of the book are donated to the charity Walking with the Wounded. The reason why the proceeds are donated to the charity are explained in the opening chapter of the book. On this month's podcast, we meet Pen Hadow. Pen is an explorer and world record holder. He's the only person to trek solo without resupply from Canada to the North Geographic Pole. His remarkable feat in 2003 has not been repeated since. Some argue it is comparable in difficulty to making the first ascent of Everest solo and without oxygen. Within months of completing the North Pole expedition, Pen went on to become the only Briton to have trekked without resupply to both the North and South Geographic Poles. In 2009, he formed GeoMission, a pioneering environmental sponsorship organisation which investigates the rates, causes and global impacts of the fast disappearing Arctic sea ice. In this podcast, we talk about Pen's expeditions, his world records, the concept of luck, physical and psychological challenges, setbacks, failures, pressure, mindset management, and global warming. And with that, I introduce you to Pen Hadow.
Well, I'm Pen Hadow. And if I'm known for anything at all, it's probably for going solo to the North Geographic Pole from Canada without any resupplies, which hadn't been done before, and it turns out hasn't been done since.
So the key stats from that were, I believe it took you 64 days, and you covered 478 miles, and you carried a sledge around 265 kilograms and endured temperatures of about minus 45 degrees C.
Yeah, well, the temperatures did go as low as that. I think the first 35 days, from memory, they were between minus 28 and minus 45 degrees centigrade as an ambient air temperature that excludes any wind chill, which was a particularly cold season. And there were some benefits to that, in fact, because, of course, extended cold at that degree of coldness tends to mean that there are clear skies, clear blue skies, very much like in this country, very little wind, so there's very little ice movement, so there's very little cracking in the ice. And when the ice did crack due to other reasons like surface currents and tides, within 8 hours, at those sort of temperatures, it's frozen over to a thickness where 2 ice floes are pulled apart, there's open water in between. They refreeze to a thickness of 4 or 5 centimetres over just 8 hours, such that you can walk across it. So there were issues, negatives, downsides, and so on, and risks even associated with the deep cold for that duration. But there were some upsides.
So before we talk about the North Pole, can we talk about the fact that as a very young person, you seem to push yourself quite extensively, and a couple of instances I'd be interested to talk about is the apple tree experiment.
There was never a conscious understanding of why I was so interested as a relatively young boy, aged 6, 7 years old, in what it would feel like at the interface between sort of extreme physical effort, and, if you like, the psychological experience that might, come about when you're in that zone. Yes, so, sorry, the apple tree. Well, classic example of what I've just been talking about. We had an orchard there was a tree. It was a wonderful, quite large apple tree, and I used to climb about it quite a lot, and climb as high as I could. And one day I thought, well, I wonder what would happen if, and what it would feel like to hang myself upside down. So on one of the lower boughs, I sort of suspended myself upside down with my legs hooked under my knees over the branch, hang down from there like a bat. It's probably about 6 foot or so above the ground. And I just thought, well, how long can I stay like this, suspended upside down? And after a considerable time, my mother, who was in the house, had begun to think, well, where the blazes is he? Haven't seen him and started to sort of worry. Came out from the house and started walking across the lawn of the garden, started shouting for me. And then to her horror, and I could I vaguely remember hearing her voice, but I had actually been upside down for 3 3/4 hours. That's a long time for a small boy. And my head was quite swollen with blood that had flowed down to the bottom end, as it were, my head being the lowest part. And my head was sort of pounding, and I wasn't really aware of what my mother was shouting or getting concerned about. And anyway, she found me, and I looked pretty peculiar. And she was terrified, actually, because she'd thought that I'd fallen from the upper branches and was literally had caught myself and had become entangled in this branch lower down. And was probably equally horrified to learn later that it was all part of a deliberate experiment. And of course, I never really thought through what would actually happen if I had passed out and my legs would have slipped and I'd have fallen not that far, but 6 foot unconscious. Probably might have done me some serious damage to my head or neck, I suppose. So you could argue not the brightest experiment. There you go.
When you moved on from education and got into the world of work, did you feel a huge amount of pressure to get a sort of so-called normal job?
So I read this article about Mark McCormack, who used to run the Mark McCormack Sports Organisation, also known as International Management Group, or IMG. They were the biggest sports marketing agency in the world. They represented the Winter Olympics at the time, and most of the sports stars one's heard of in Formula One and tennis and golf at the time. And I read this article about him coming to visit Wimbledon because he had basically helped to put Wimbledon where it is now in terms of its financing, with TV rights sales and corporate hospitality sales and ticket sales and all sorts of things. And I thought, gosh, that looks like an interesting job. I could imagine myself acting as an agent for sports personalities. That sounds like a really cool job. I know. It does seem like I could probably do this. So I went through a very particular process, probably not particularly of interest to talk about here, but I did and got the job. And that set me for 4 years into the world of rights identification, rights management, rights sales, as in sponsorship rights, endorsement rights, all sorts of rights that are associated with intellectual property rights that people and events have. And of course, when I left, that completely inadvertently, but it set me up with the perfect background and experience to be able to identify and package and manage and sell rights to expeditions. And polar expeditions require very large sums of money, and you need corporate support and sponsor support to make them happen. So that was entirely coincidental.
If we go on to talk about the North Pole specifically, so it was a case of third time lucky, if I'm right. Your first 2 attempts didn't go to plan. What did you learn from that? And then can you sort of take us through, and no day is a normal day on an expedition, but what's a kind of day like on an expedition?
So I decided in 1989 to go solo to the North Pole from Canada, no resupplies. I made my first attempt in 1994. I relied heavily, as it turns out, on my sort of self-belief and confidence, attitude, if you will. And and had underestimated, slightly unfortunately, if you like, it wasn't entirely my fault. I thought I knew enough. I'd done a 70-day expedition, largely on sea ice, and thought that I knew enough about sea ice, having travelled between the islands of Svalbard, to be able to just change the direction, and rather than go as a two-man operation, go as a one-man operation, which I realised that was going to be a bit of an upgrade, but I thought I understood sea ice. And I was young, I was sort of 28, no, I was sort of 31 or whatever, and I just thought I can do this, but failed. We'll come back to the notion of failure. I then went again in 1998. This time, I knew a great deal more, having run a guide service, having actually set up a guide service deliberately to bank the famous 10,000 hours of experience that most explorers or polar people on the Arctic Ocean don't get. They have a go. They might have 5 days on the ice or 20 days or 40 days. That is the sum total of their experience. They may have another go. And I thought this is one of the fundamental reasons why we're not succeeding and almost don't deserve to succeed in this really sort of high-end, pioneering sort of stuff, cutting-edge stuff. We just need to learn a lot more, be more professional about it. So I set up a guide service, built up the hours, went there from every year almost. I was up there for months at a time and really started to understand the Arctic Ocean sea ice cover and how to work with it rather than try and beat it, which is a sort of flawed approach. And so I failed in 98 because I thought I've got so much experience there. I'm not just going to go there solo without resupply. I'm going to do it in half the time that anyone's ever done it. And I'm not even going to take a sledge. It is time that we went from the mountaineers' sort of concept of a siege approach to somewhere like Everest to an alpine approach. Lightning strike, very little kit. You know exactly what you're doing. You're super fit, super competent, and it's go, go, go.
Less kit, less weight.
Yeah, and just being that very powerful combination of competence and confidence. You know, the confidence is based on genuine competence, and you can just take things to a whole new level. And I thought that the whole sphere of polar exploration, polar adventure, polar record breaking, if you like, ground breaking, we were ready. That we'd come to that point, we could take it to the next level. Anyway, I did pretty well. I got I think I did get further. I got about 2/3 of the way to the pole, and faster than anyone had done it, even with resupplies and so on. So I was on the right lines, but I failed because I really damaged my knee very badly, partly because I had such a very heavy rucksack. So maybe I deserved to fail. So it wasn't until 2003 when I got everything right. I had the right amount of confidence and competence, and I'd set the right goal, which was simply to get solo from A to B. Nothing clever. If you want to do something clever on top, well, fine, but do that once you've done what you originally set out to do. Keep it simple. The three legs of the triangle were I got in the right proportions and succeeded. But going back to your comment about it, just third time lucky. I mean, that's a classic phrase, but I think underlying that is something else. Because you could say, up to a point, you just got lucky with the conditions. Right? Yes, some people would have found those conditions unbearable. Those temperatures for that long have created a lot of meaningful, significant issues and risks. So they would have argued that was not good and helpful. Also, by going back again and again and again, that's hard-won luck. I went through a lot. It was hard failing, if you will, twice and keeping going and burning more and more of my life to be able to achieve this particular thing. My choice, but it was hard, not just for me, for people around me. So it was hard-won luck. That's my point.
It's not divine luck that is bestowed on you by chance. It is essentially you building the experience, building the time, putting in the 10,000 hours plus to determine a level of confidence and competence that allows you to execute the expedition.
Succinctly put, but what I would add that you could say, and I used to feel that I had failed in 94 and I'd failed in 98. and only succeeded in 2003. But actually, I now see that not only were they weren't even temporary setbacks. Right? I really feel that I understand that they were, in 94 and 98, the essential learning opportunities. They were providing the keys to how I would be able to go on to eventually succeed, and the underlying thing was to keep going. I never gave up. I never quit. I never failed. These were just incidents along the way to doing what I wanted to achieve.
They were like necessary steps.
Yeah.
And that's probably quite a good analogy, really, because, they were simply the required steps that you were taking to get to the North Pole solo.
I might have got lucky, sheer. I might have got amazing conditions on that first attempt, and attitude, and I may have got there, and that would have been wonderful. But it would have been genuinely fortuitous. By the end, 2003, I could have dealt with a wide range of external factors that were not going to be playing, to my advantage, and internal issues that might be going on, and so the chances. I was always about as I came to understand it, maximizing the likelihood of success. I could never guarantee success to me, my sponsors, or anyone else, but I could maximize that, and eventually I was going to get there.
Shall we talk about the psychological tricks? Because, from what you're saying, the importance on the expedition of psychology is critical. And I remember that one of the things that you had to face was significant ice rubble fields, which when you're pulling a 200 kg plus sled can slow down your kind of daily progress. And so how you deal with that psychologically, I would imagine, is vitally important. I should point out that it was 265 pounds. And I have a ghastly feeling, because someone else said 200 kilos recently in a talk, said, how do you manage to pull 200 kilos edge? I thought maybe my website or something is, or in the book I put by mistake 200 kilos, because that really would be a heroic feat. But that aside, most people on the face of it, I think, imagine that it's you need to be a big hairy bloke and it's a physical project. But well, of course, it is a physical project, and it's seriously so. But most people, men and women of any build, I know some extremely slightly built British women explorers and adventurers who can move heavy objects around in a cold place. So it's more than that. So then it's an indeterminate percentage, but by far the greater percentage of what gets you there is what you might call your psychological management, how you manage yourself in your head. And there are some deliberate techniques that I realized would be valuable, if not essential, to help me, anyway, get there. But I would just, before delving into those, I would go on to say that, in fact, I would be more specific than saying it's a psychological test. It's an emotional intelligence test. It's your ability to recognize and identify an incredible range of emotional responses that flare up. I know I'm not alone, but of course the combination of these varies from person to person, no doubt. But it's quite marked. The fact, if you're on your own in an inert and inanimate environment, certainly inanimate environment, how come you get so incredibly depressed, so angry, so frustrated, so elated, so hateful? It's like, seriously, what is going on? There's no one else there. You've got some serious issues here, son, and I'm not sure this is the place to sort them out. But this is what happens, and it happens in teams as well, pairs and trios and bigger teams. And you read about it in every polar book you've ever read. People really experiencing extreme emotional responses. When you're on your own, the trouble is
then they're no less in their extent and probably in their range. But there's no one there to say, hang on a minute, you're just having a bad day. Get over yourself. Get a life. I'll help you pull some of your parts of your sledge today. Well, I'll take some of the load off your sledge. Or let's stop now and have a cup of tea and a laugh. Or, there's none of that. You are like a fly in a jam jar, and it is entirely down to you. And to make the point, you can go from thinking, I'm on schedule, I'm going to get there, this is going to be the expedition that I make it. I'm feeling pretty bullish, and within 10 minutes you can go from there to a place of despair, absolute despair, and where I'm out. I cannot take the pressure anymore of this combination of the cold and the environment, and can't I get there, and the various sufferings that go on, physiological and indeed psychological. So how do you keep stable? So you have to identify, right, I'm feeling very frustrated. Fine. Why am I feeling frustrated? Okay, that's why I'm feeling fine. And then putting it back in the box and quietly closing the lid and saying, okay, so you felt frustrated, fair enough, but we've got something to do here, and it's a distraction. Now is not the time to be feeling frustrated. It's not a helpful response. And keeping, if you're a yacht, it's like the mast is constantly being bammed over, almost touching the water, and you've got to bring up the mast and keep a nice steady course emotionally. And it's that ability to recover, and ultimately to know that's the challenge. Emotional stability is the challenge when your mind, a lot of the time, is desperately trying to pull you down and pull you apart and make you go home.
Yeah, so you had some tricks to deal with that.
Well, I did. There were 5 scenarios that, from experience, I absolutely knew that were going to occur. And as an example, one of them was if you climb up over a pressure ridge, which might be 2, 3, 4 meters high, sometimes sort of chaotic jumbles of ice where 2 ice floes have crunched together. You get to the top, you've heaved your sledge up, and you maybe done several of those in the last hour, and you think, gosh, this is really going slow. And then you get to the top, and you look due north, and slightly and then sort of to the northwest, and then across to the northeast, and all you can't see, there's no flat ice. There are no ice floes at all. The whole lot has been crunched in. It's just a massive, chaotic area. It's like a ploughed field, badly ploughed field, times 200 in scale. It's like, and you are going to be in there for as far as the eye can say, which is like 2 to 3 kilometers in those conditions, maybe a little bit, tiny bit more. You're going to be in there for the rest of the day. You could be in there for 8 hours and maybe only make a kilometer, even half a kilometer. And you think, right, well, if I'm going to be in here for 2 or 3 days, how am I ever going to make that time up? I mean, at the far end, that's like 30 miles. You can do 10 miles a day. How am I going to make this up? If I have any more like this, the project's over. Maybe it's going to be like, so your mind sort of looking for. So I thought, right, I knew this was going to happen. So this is a moment of despair that tends to happen. And it's compounded by being hyperglycemic for the effort of getting up to the top of these ridges. You're now really wobbly, you're shaking, you're faint, you have to stand there or kneel down or sit down, just let the sugar levels recover. And it all conspires to this is just not happening. So I had this technique where I would, as soon as I had a scene like this, I would nip in the bud the normal emotional response by envisaging myself in a musical recording studio where there's a wild rock band playing behind the glass, really ripping it up. And I'm smoking some sort of cigar. For those of a certain generation, this was the Hamlet cigar sort of scenario, TV investment. And there are all sorts of dials, knobs and things and sliders that you're sort of vaguely pushing around in a sort of absent-minded way, looking at the band who are all going for it and giving you the thumbs up and hope you get clocking this amazing recording. And actually you're listening to some really lovely classical music. You couldn't give a stuff what they're up to. And it's this idea of just disassociating. Okay, the ice out there, horrible, nasty, not what you want. But just knowing that's just a feeling. It's just ice, and that you have control. You can choose to just play a different sort of emotional response. That's the scenario, and that you have a choice, and that you have control, and there are benefits in executing that control. And then I'd switch from that instant little image to, no, it's a privilege to be here. No one sent me here. It's not a punishment that I'm up here. So stop feeling sorry for yourself. This is it. In fact, if it was all flat ice with no open water and no crunched ice, everyone would be doing it. I mean, people have been doing this every year for decades. I've got an opportunity here. And this is what I'm about to do now is one of the things that people pull out because of. And you're not going to do that because you know what the trick is. And it's about how to manage your emotional response to it. So it's a very empowering. These were the exciting. Basically, this was the opportunity to show what you're made of, not, it's just going to break me and the whole thing that the world's against me and the ice is against me and blaming external factors.
And that's when it really mattered. That's when it really counted.
If you like, those were the sorts of lessons I had learnt the hard way through previous failures.
Or previous learning experiences.
Yeah, exactly right.
Amidst all this, you also have the potential risk of encountering a polar bear.
I never saw a bear on my solo expedition in 2003. I did see footprints of bears, and I did see a seal carcass that's probably been killed 24 to 48 hours before, quite near the end, quite near the pole. So I knew they were around. The thing about bears, I mean, there's a lot I could say about bears, but probably the salient point is they are around. You never know when they're going to show up. There is absolutely no way of being able to even say, well, this is a relatively high risk environment day today, or location today, or weather environment, or even sea ice conditions. So you have no idea. And if you're not prepared all the time mentally to know what to do, what is going to be your sequence of actions, it is not something you can create or invent on the spot. You need to know, to have these drills. And it's a drill. There's a drill for when you're traveling, and there's a drill for when you're in the tent. And there's actually a drill even when you're asleep. And then if you become aware of a bear. So if you like, there are 3 drills. And it is a mental routine. And I mean, to a degree, it's a game of Russian roulette. But you can get the odds more on your side. It's terribly easy not to. But you know how Sod's law works. The day or after 2 or 3 days of not having done it, that is exactly when the bear turns up, and you've drastically reduced your chances of being able to manage the situation and get out alive. So it's one of those classic situations, ultra low frequency or likelihood of happening, ultra high impact if you have an encounter, potentially. So those are the hardest scenarios to manage for any organization or any individual. But I chose life.
And particularly worrying when one thing we haven't talked about is when you had to put on the immersion suit to cross water.
Yes. When I put on the immersion suit and was in the water, you are unable to defend yourself against bears, basically. There is a loaded shotgun on the top of the sledge, which you're towing behind you as you swim. It's following behind you a few meters behind. But with the sort of integral mitted hands, if you like, of the suit, you couldn't possibly, and you're in the water, you couldn't get the shotgun off the top of the sledge and aim it and fire it. I mean, it's just inconceivable. And you can't get up onto the sledge in the water. So you would look very carefully, as best you could, around what we call a lead, or an area of open water, before you got in. But I was in the water on one occasion for between 3 and 4 hours. So the idea, a bear could turn up over a pressure ridge at any point. 10 seconds after you've done your scan, you drop into the water and the bear comes over the ridge. You couldn't have seen it before, and now it's there. So there's a limit, but you just take what reasonable precautions you can, and live or not by those decisions.
when you set out, can you just talk about, it's a distance of 770 kilometers you're taking on. How do you not become overwhelmed by that on day one or day two?
The first thing is you need to spend a lot of time on the sea ice to know how it works, not just to read about it in a book or spoken to someone about it. You need to really, in my view, have experienced it and ultimately have some sort of relationship with it. And that took me quite a few years to realise that it wasn't me against it, and that it was all about me and this wretched stuff I was having to sort of travel around across. And the more you started to work with it and be bothered to understand why it behaves in all sorts of different ways in terms of its movement and structures and so on, the better placed you are to be able to achieve whatever it is you're trying to achieve in that situation or environment.
Did you also break down the distance mentally as
well? So it is a very long way, and you would go mad to the point of despair, which is what most expeditions who fail experience, because you make so little progress at the start, because your sledge is at its heaviest, of course, especially if you're going without resupply. You've got all your food and all your fuel, which are the two heaviest. Food's the heaviest component. If you've got 75 days of food, that's 75 kilos or 170 pounds or so right there. Fuel, third of a kilo a day, roughly. So that's, you can do the maths. That's the next biggest weight by far. And then you've just got to tend to a few bits and bobs making up the balance. So you've got a very heavy sledge. It's when the temperatures are at their coldest, so the frictional drag effect on the sledge runners is much greater at -40 than at -5. A sledge that you can use almost all your strength to move 1 meter in -40, -45, on exact the same surface at -5, it will run relatively smoothly. So you've got a huge drag, and then because it's why it's the hardest route, you've got the ice is moving towards you from the pole towards the coast that you're setting off from. So it's all crunched up against the coast. It rams up against it and just folds like concertinas into these chaotic jumbles of ice and pressure ridges and rubble fields and so on. And so you've got your heavy sledge, difficult drag, up and over, up and over. There are 4,500 discrete ridges that I had to go over on my way to the pole. So it's a very hard start. And if you don't have a plan that you're confident in, and mine was to do 3 miles a day, 3 nautical miles a day, for the first 20 days out of roughly 70 days, leaving you, so you've done three lots of 20, 60 miles. So you've still got that 60 nautical miles. It gets a bit complicated, but, still the vast proportion to do in the remaining 40 to 50 days. You need to believe that's really possible. That the ice really will improve in its condition and be less rubbly. The temperatures really will warm up, and you really will, be less oppressed and be able to think more clearly because the temperatures are warming up.
So let's just touch on the point when you reach the pole. What happens in your mind at that point? How soon after that do you start thinking about the next challenge, the next goal?
To reach the pole, I had to burn a lot of bridges behind me. My wife of the time, Mary, without whom there is no possibility of me having been able to have set off on attempt 1 and attempt 2, or our attempt 3, without her support in all sorts of ways. None of this would be possible. None of it. But I had to burn a lot of bridges, and we and Mary in particular put up with a great deal of sacrifice compared to many of my peers who were surging forward on various careers. And I burnt those bridges in all sorts of different ways, including having no fallback plan. And even Mary would say, partly because she knew what it was like for me, and therefore to a large extent for her, if I had failed, in inverted commas again, he said, well, you must have a plan B. What are you going to do? What's going to be your way? And I said, if I have a plan B, that's not going to help. I need to have no plans. It's this or nothing. And so there was all sorts of subtle ways in which I lashed myself to the mast, if you will, of this project. When I arrived at the pole, I sort of deliberately had no anticipation of what it would feel like. And I was quite intrigued, going back to the old apple tree, what it would actually feel like. And I can tell you exactly what it felt like. It was a sort of technicolor, and we're talking within seconds of actually standing at exactly 90 degrees north, around the point around which the entire planet is rotating. Not that I might have you get any sense of that rotation or being on the top of the world. It's just like another piece of ice. But it was a sense of liberation, of this. I don't know how to I've never really thought how to express it better, but it wasn't a ball and chain, but there was or an albatross around my neck. I had created this project that was incredibly difficult to do, and since 1989 had been increasingly the primary and increasingly exclusive focus of my life, and to finally stand there and think, I'll never have to worry about this again. I always knew I could do it. I've done it hundreds of times in my head, but it's ruddy annoying that I hadn't actually done it. And now I've actually done it. And it was a real OMG moment. And I just weights just fell off me that I would never have to think about this again. I had finally done it. And the sense of freedom, liberation, that the headspace that it suddenly freed up to think about other things that normal people think about all the time, and I'd never thought about. I don't know what, but just acres of space, and that was a really powerful thing. But in that, and I would say within seconds of that experience, I was thinking, actually, this is, to me, it was the finishing post. Until I reached the post, it was the finishing post. I had no plan beyond this, because there was no point until I reached the finishing post. This was the only thing to be finished. But of course, in those seconds of arriving, I realised it was just a stepping stone. It's a waypoint in life. Of course it is. But if you told me that before, I'd think, what are you talking about? I don't understand. So it was suddenly, right, wow, what do I do now? And I didn't really have a plan. As it happens, I went to the South Pole and partnered and guided a project to the South Pole 9 months later. But that was sort of incidental. It wasn't part of my life plan or mission, really. So it was very exciting, properly exciting.
Now you're on dry land most of the time. How often would you say you take risks or experience fear?
I can tell you that I haven't told anyone, actually. I don't think I've told anybody that my sense of risk has really changed. Not because of this project, particularly, I don't think. I think it's more of an age thing. But for example, when I'm walking along the tube platform and there's a yellow line in which people are encouraged not to go beyond that and nearer the train, and which of course sometimes you have to just to make your way along there. I'm very nervous, and I maybe think, oh God, really, but there's just lots of little things, how I drive, how I walk around on the streets. I would even go almost as far as say how I walk down a staircase. I mean, I'm not like a little old man who's terrified of everything. I'm just aware that there are all sorts of what I would call defensive strategies to reduce the risk of coming into harm's way. Which is quite ironic, actually, thinking, well, hang on a minute, you go to the North Pole entirely on your own for 75 days, and now this sounds to me like a very severe psychological response to what you did, or what you put yourself through. But I can equally tell you now, unbeknownst to most people, and by the time they hear this, that I'm planning to do another solo project.
Oh, really?
So, I'm not that little old man, and I'm not that scared of life. But it does intrigue me. I think it's more of an age thing.
Can you say any more about this solo project? Is that TBC?
I think I can tell you that really what I'm doing is attracting as much attention to the international waters that lie north of the national jurisdictions of the various countries that surround the Arctic Ocean, Russia, Canada, America, and so on, which is the North Pole is set in that sea area. They're technically known as international waters or high seas. It's an area that is owned by everybody. The marine water body is owned by every country in the world, not just the people nearby. And it finds itself, what's known technically as the Central Arctic Ocean is the specific area. It finds itself at the forefront of the emerging biggest challenge, you might argue, that we face as a human race, which is how we manage at a global scale, in terms of the global community, our planetary resources. There is now so much pressure that if you like, the resources offered by natural resources in every shape and form offered by within sovereign territories is now not enough. So the pressure is now building up on what are these ultimately called international spaces. Space is an international space. There's an international treaty how we manage activities in space. Antarctica is an international space. There's an Antarctic treaty to manage that. The atmosphere is another international space. And people know perhaps that there's the big United Nations climate change negotiations. So the global community are now trying to manage the atmosphere in terms of carbon emissions and so on. And the oceans, or the high seas areas, the deep, oceans, the abyssal parts of the oceans, is another international space. And the Arctic Ocean is the one that's under most pressure right now because the sea ice is going. So it's now becoming newly accessible and newly vulnerable to what would be called disruptive and extractive activities. So my focus on this expedition is to draw people's attention to high seas of the North Pole area, and ultimately I'm interested in trying to bring about a United Nations resolution to heighten protection for it as an exemplar for how we actually manage the other high seas areas that will eventually come under similar pressures.
So when would you say you are happiest?
Oh, I can answer that. Well, actually, can I answer that? Really? I'm most happy when I'm thinking over a cappuccino in a nice cafe on the side of an attractive harbour, preferably in the West Country, specifically probably Devon.
Sounds nice.
That's when I'm probably happiest. But probably there are a number of other situations. I'm equally happy listening to BBC Radio 4 Extra, which I discovered relatively late in life, which I find hilarious and thoroughly entertaining for much of the day.
And a question I like to ask about, do you think the mindset you adopt or the way you react to events is a choice?
I think that is one of the most profound realizations that one can have. So the answer to your question is yes, I believe that one has a choice. It takes one into a whole new way of understanding and interpreting the world. I believe that once you get to a certain depth of understanding and a particular way of understanding the world, you can see that you can choose left or right, black or white, right, wrong are the basics, but then how you respond emotionally. You can be very angry, or you can be very, okay, so that's why am I reacting in this way? And if you understand yourself, the better you understand yourself, the more you understand why you're reacting that way and why it may actually not be helpful.
But to recognise the element of choice, I think, is a fascinating angle.
It's very empowering because once you realise that there's a choice in how you react to events and to people, and that you don't have to keep reacting in the same way as you always have done, there is a choice, and understanding how you can unlock that choice and then actually deploying that choice is super powerful. Super powerful.
The last couple of questions I'd like to ask are, what would you say to your 18-year-old self?
Be more aware of the importance of the people around you and that you draw to you and how you nurture or work, build those relationships. I think would be one thing. Not so much that I feel I haven't treated people well. I just feel I should have treated them better or slightly differently, perhaps. Pick your targets for what you want to really put a huge amount of effort into achieving at the highest perfection, excellence or whatever, and good enough, just relax on a lot of other stuff. Just doing good enough, that's fine. Focus your real all that spare energy on the things that are really important.
So prioritize.
But I suppose, yeah.
Another thing I wanted to ask is, do you have any belief systems or values or rituals that you follow? And these can be religious, philosophical, non-religious, spiritual, can be anything really.
I suppose I have some guiding principles which have emerged and evolved over time as I've got older, and I suppose feel up to a point I wish I'd had when I was younger, but maybe that's just how life works. One of them is to let death be my guide, by which I mean know that I'm going to die. It happens to everybody. It could happen at any time. And so use your time in the knowledge that, in other words, well, in inverted commas, whatever well is for anybody, because it may get taken away or you may be incapacitated at any point. And so rather than seeing death as a frightening thing and a terminal thing, it is actually the very thing that should enliven and catalyse the most, fulfilling life or day or hour that one can have. So it's not quite the same as living every day as your last, because that's a very hard thing to do, because it sort of ends up being meaningless, I feel, because you can't, if you took that literally, of course, you sort of explode within a few hours. But anyway, that's one of my principles. And another is to treat others as one would want to be treated oneself. And that seems to have a lot of mileage in it.
Couldn't agree more. I think that's a perfect place to end it.
Thank you very much, Toby.
Thanks very much, Ben.